She came to Red Hollow with 2 suitcases, a name nobody knew, and a face that made grown men laugh out loud on a Tuesday morning. They didn't even wait for her to step down from the stagecoach. That's how bad it was. That's how cruel a town can be when it decides it already knows everything about a woman before she opens her mouth. But here's what Red Hollow didn't know, and what it would spend the next several months learning the hard way. Mara Ellison had survived things that would have broken every single one of them, and she hadn't come all this way to be broken by strangers. If you've ever been judged before you were given a chance to speak, stay with me. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach rolled into Red Hollow on a Thursday, just past 11 in the morning, when the sun was high and mean and the main street was busy enough that there was no shortage of witnesses. Mara had been sitting with her spine pressed straight against the wooden bench for the last 4 hours, watching Montana Territory blur past the window in long brown sweeps of prairie and rock. She hadn't slept the night before, hadn't been able to. She'd spent the dark hours in a roadside inn somewhere outside of Billings, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, rereading the last letter Elias Boone had sent her until the words stopped making sense and became just shapes on paper. "I am not a man of poetry," he'd written, in the careful, slightly stiff penmanship of someone who had taught himself to read as an adult. "But I am an honest man, and I believe you deserve honesty more than you deserve flattery. The ranch is hard. The winters are harder. Lydia is 9 years old, and she hasn't laughed since her mother passed. I don't know what I have to offer a woman, except a home that needs work, a child that needs love, and a man who is trying his best not to let everything fall apart. If that is enough, then perhaps we are a match." It had been enough. Or at least, it had seemed like enough, at 2 in the morning in a town she was already leaving behind. Now, as the stagecoach shuddered to a stop and the driver called out Red Hollow like he was announcing something worth arriving at, Mara felt the first real tremor of doubt move through her chest. She gathered her traveling bag, straightened the collar of her coat, checked, out of pure habit, that the small pin her father had given her, a simple brass thing shaped like a compass, was still fastened at her lapel. It was. She took one breath, pushed open the door, and stepped out onto the landing board. The laughter started almost immediately. Not from everyone. Just from 3 men standing near the post office, 2 of them leaning on the railing like they'd been waiting for entertainment and had finally found it. The third one didn't laugh. He just stared with his arms crossed and his expression somewhere between pity and contempt, which was somehow worse. "Lord Almighty," one of the laughing men said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "That's Boone's bride?" "That's what showed up," the other one said. Mara set her foot on the boardwalk and took the full weight of what they were looking at. A woman of 32 years, plain-faced by most standards, with dark eyes set a little too far apart, a nose that had been broken once and healed slightly off-center, and the kind of broad-shouldered, sturdy build that hard work produces in a woman, but that the world tends not to find decorative. She was not what anyone would have called a beauty. She'd known that her whole life. She'd made her peace with it, or something close enough to peace that it mostly held together. What she hadn't prepared for was having it announced to a public street. The driver handed down her 2 cases from the roof rack. He didn't meet her eyes. She noticed that too. She picked up both cases herself. No one offered, and stood on the boardwalk while the town of Red Hollow conducted a slow, unconscious audit of everything about her. Women near the dry goods store had stopped their conversation. A man outside the barber shop had turned to look. Even a boy of about 12, who'd been sweeping the front step of what appeared to be a feed store, had paused with his broom in hand and his mouth slightly open. Mara had spent a significant portion of her life being looked at like this. She knew the arithmetic of it by now. The quick inventory of her face, the slight compression of people's expressions when the inventory came up short by whatever standard they were measuring against. She knew how to hold her chin level. She knew how not to flinch. But knowing how not to flinch and actually not flinching were 2 different skills. And right now, standing alone on a boardwalk in a town she'd never seen before, with her whole life packed into 2 suitcases and a man she'd never met supposedly somewhere nearby, the gap between those 2 skills felt enormous. "Elias Boone sent away for a mail-order wife, and that's what came?" The woman's voice cut across the street with the particular clarity of someone who'd spent years making sure she was heard. Mara turned. The speaker was standing outside what appeared to be the town's better dressmaker. A tall woman, finely dressed, somewhere in her mid-40s, with silver blonde hair and the posture of someone who expected furniture to rearrange itself when she entered a room. She was speaking to the woman beside her, but her voice was calibrated for the street. He must have been desperate. Poor man, the other woman agreed, under her breath, but not quite. Mara set her cases down. She didn't do it dramatically. She just set them down because her arms were tired and she needed a moment, and there was no one to help her, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She stood on the Red Hollow boardwalk with her 2 suitcases at her feet and her compass pin on her lapel, and the particular loneliness of a woman who has traveled a very long way to meet a future that is looking, right now, extremely uncertain. That was when she heard the footsteps. Small footsteps. Quick and purposeful, coming from the direction of a wagon parked perhaps 30 yards down the street. Mara looked toward the sound without expecting anything and saw a child. A girl, 9 or 10 years old, brown-haired and serious-faced, wearing a dress that was clean but had been mended at least twice, walking straight toward her, not at a hesitant pace, not the way a child approaches a stranger, at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be and that somewhere was here. The girl stopped directly in front of Mara. She looked up at her with dark eyes that were remarkably steady for someone her age, and for a moment she didn't say anything. She just looked. Then she reached out and took Mara's left hand in both of hers. "She's beautiful," the girl said. She didn't say it to anyone in particular. She said it the way you say a fact, the way you say the sky is blue, or the ground is hard, as if it were simply true and simply obvious, and she couldn't understand why nobody else had noticed. The street went quiet, not completely quiet. There was still the sound of wind and distant horses and the ordinary noise of a frontier town at midday. But the human noise stopped. The commentary stopped. The laughter from the men near the post office had already faded, and now even the low murmur near the dressmakers went silent, because you cannot very easily contradict a 9-year-old girl saying something with that much certainty in her voice. Mara looked down at the child. Her throat had tightened in a way she hadn't anticipated and wasn't prepared to manage in public. "Are you Lydia?" she said. "Yes." The girl kept hold of her hand. "Papa is with the wagon. He was going to come, but I wanted to come first." She paused, considering. "I wanted to see you before everyone else had opinions." Mara almost laughed. Instead, she pressed her lips together and nodded, because she didn't trust her voice quite yet. "That was wise," she said, when she could. Elias Boone was not what she'd expected either, though in a different direction. She'd imagined someone older, or more weathered, or more obviously defeated-looking, because the letters had carried a certain weight to them that she'd associated with a man on his last reserves. Instead, the man who walked toward her from the direction of the wagon was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and sun-dark, with a beard that had been trimmed recently enough that it was clear he'd made an effort, and eyes that were a complicated shade of gray that didn't quite match any other part of his face. He moved like a man who was accustomed to physical work, and not accustomed to being watched while doing it. There was something slightly stiff in his approach, as if he'd rehearsed what he was going to say, and the reality of her standing there was interfering with the rehearsal. He stopped a few feet away from her. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Not disappointment, she thought, but something more complicated than simple recognition. Then he looked at Lydia, still standing beside Mara with her hand in hers, and something in his face shifted slightly. "I see you've met my daughter," he said. "She introduced herself," Mara said. She was very efficient about it. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "She usually is." He put out his hand. "Elias Boone. Mara Ellison." She shook it. His grip was firm and slightly calloused, and he let go at the appropriate moment, which she noted because she'd met men who didn't. He glanced down the street, a quick, almost involuntary glance, as if checking for something, and she understood without him saying anything that he was aware of what had happened when she arrived. He'd probably heard it from where the wagon was parked. Maybe he'd watched some of it. "I'm sorry," he said, quietly enough that the words were just between them. "Red Hollow has a narrow view of things sometimes." "I've met narrow views before," she said. "I imagine you have." He reached down and picked up both of her suitcases without asking. "The ranch is about 4 miles out. Road's not terrible today." It was not a romantic speech. It was not the kind of thing a woman could hold on to later and feel warm about. But there was something in the plain honesty of it, the complete absence of performance, that Mara found unexpectedly more reassuring than any poetry would have been. She followed him to the wagon, with Lydia still holding her hand. But the ride to the Boone Ranch covered 4 miles of rough track through dry country, flanked on the west by a long ridge of mountains that turned purple at midday and the color of iron at dusk. Mara sat in the wagon bed with Lydia beside her, and Elias drove with his back to them, his shoulders carrying a certain tension she could see even from behind. Lydia talked almost continuously, which surprised Mara, because the girl had seemed so serious in town. Turned out the seriousness was situational. On her home ground, or at least on the road to it, she had opinions about a remarkable number of subjects. "The chickens are named," Lydia told her. "All of them. Papa said not to name them, but I named them anyway. And now he knows all their names too. He just won't admit it." "What are their names?" Mara asked. "There's Harriet and Margaret, and the one with the broken foot is called Senator because she walks like she's running for something." Mara laughed. A real laugh, unexpected, the kind that comes out before you have a chance to stop it. Elias's shoulders moved slightly in the front of the wagon. He didn't turn around, but something about his posture changed. "How many are there altogether?" Mara asked. 14, but 3 of them don't have good names yet. I've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Lydia thought about this seriously. "To see what kind of names they deserved," she said. "You can't just pick a name, you have to watch first." Mara looked at the child beside her, at the complete earnestness of her face, and thought, "I would like to know this person when she's grown up. She's going to be formidable." "That's a very good philosophy," Mara said. "I know," said Lydia, without any particular arrogance, just as another fact. The ranch was not beautiful. Mara had understood from the letters that it wasn't prosperous. She hadn't understood until she saw it, exactly what the combination of hard years, a devastating grief, and one man trying to run everything alone actually looked like in physical form. The main house was a 2-story structure, wood-framed, which had probably been solid and even handsome when it was first built. Now the porch railing had a section missing. 2 of the outbuildings had roofs that were visibly compromised. The kitchen garden, there was a kitchen garden, or the remains of one, was choked with weeds except for a small, determined patch of root vegetables near the fence that Mara suspected Lydia was responsible for. The yard was functional rather than kept. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her something about Elias's priorities and was not necessarily a criticism. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at all of it. She did not let her face show what she was thinking, partly out of courtesy and partly because what she was thinking was more complicated than simple dismay. It was something closer to, "I can see what this was supposed to be. I can see where it started going wrong. I think I know how to fix most of it." She had grown up on her father's farm in Ohio, a small operation that her father had run with the particular combination of ingenuity and stubbornness that characterized men who refuse to accept the limitations of what they have. He had taught her, among other things, how to read a property the way you read a person. To look not at what it is right now, but at what it's built to be, what it's struggling toward, where the wound is that's keeping it from getting there. The Boone Ranch had a wound, obviously, but the bones were sound. The land was good land. She could see that even from the yard, even in the dry, late-season grass. The slope of the property gave it something, though she couldn't yet name exactly what. The mountains to the west were close enough to mean something in terms of water, which she filed away in the back of her mind. "It needs some work," Elias said, from somewhere beside her. He said it flatly, without apology, but not without awareness. "Yes," she said, "it does." He seemed to have expected at least a slight softening of her agreement. When it didn't come, he looked at her for a moment with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been respect. She wasn't sure yet which of those things she was more likely to get from him. "The house is livable," he said. "I put fresh linens in the room." He paused. "Your room." "Thank you." "I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought we might wait a while before—" Another stop. His jaw worked briefly. "The letters were one thing, but you just arrived and I didn't want to assume." Mara looked at him steadily. She appreciated the fumbling. Men who fumbled about this particular subject were generally safer than men who didn't. That seems sensible, she said. Something in him eased slightly. Right, good. He picked up her cases again. I'll show you the house. Yeah, the inside of the house was a sadder version of the outside in some ways. The rooms were structurally sound. Elias had not been negligent in any structural sense, but they carried the unmistakable feeling of a space that had stopped being cared for. Not from laziness, from absence, from a man who had been putting all of himself into keeping the ranch alive and had simply had nothing left over for the domestic part of existence. The kitchen was clean but bare. The curtains in the main room were sun-faded to the point of translucency. The parlor had furniture that sat in slightly wrong positions, as if it had been moved for one reason or another and never quite found its way back. There were small repairs everywhere that hadn't been made. A loose board, a door that didn't hang level, a window with a cracked pane that had been covered with oilcloth. Lydia walked beside Mara through the tour in an oddly proprietary way, pointing things out. "This is where we eat," she said, indicating the kitchen table. "Papa cooks beans mostly, and cornbread. He learned one kind of cornbread, and he makes it all the time." "Is it good cornbread?" Mara asked. "It's the only cornbread I know," Lydia said, "so I can't say for certain." From behind them, Elias made a sound that might have been a muffled version of a laugh. "This is the parlor," Lydia continued, leading the way. "Mama used to have flowers in here. Papa doesn't do the flowers." She said this without accusation, simply as information. Mara looked at the empty vase on the windowsill, a plain ceramic thing, positioned as if it had been placed deliberately once and not moved since. She looked at it for a moment and then looked away. "And this is your room," Lydia said, opening the door at the top of the stairs. The room was small and the ceiling was low, and the window looked out over the yard toward the mountain ridge. There was a bed with fresh linens. She could see they were genuinely fresh, not just recently arranged, and a plain wooden dresser and a hook on the wall for clothing and a braided rug on the floor that was old but had been recently beaten free of dust. Someone had put a small bunch of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. They were tied with a piece of brown string, and they were clearly not new flowers. They were the desiccated, papery kind that had been dried on purpose, saved from a summer that was past. Mara looked at the dried flowers for a moment. Then she looked at Lydia, who was watching her from the doorway with an expression of careful neutrality. "Did you put those there?" Mara asked. "Papa doesn't do flowers," Lydia said again. Mara pressed her lips together and nodded. "They're lovely," she said. "Thank you." Lydia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You're welcome," she said, with enormous dignity, and then went downstairs. Elias lingered in the doorway a moment longer. He looked at the flowers, then at Mara. Something moved through his expression that she was not yet equipped to read. "She's been looking forward to you," he said, in her way. "I can tell. She doesn't make it obvious," he said. "She's careful about things, who she trusts." "She seems very wise for 9, Mara said. "She is." The pride in his voice was uncomplicated and absolute. For a moment, all the stiffness went out of him, and he was simply a father talking about his daughter. "She's also stubborn as bedrock, and she argues about everything, and she'll test you in ways you won't see coming, just so you know." "I look forward to it," Mara said, and meant it. He studied her for a moment with those gray, complicated eyes. Then he nodded. "Supper's at 6. I'll make the cornbread." "I'll make something else," she said. He blinked. "You don't have to. You just arrived." "I know I don't have to," she said, "but I find cooking useful when I need to understand a kitchen." A pause. He was working out whether this was an offer or a statement of intention. It was a bit of both. "All right," he said. "Well, she made a simple potato soup and a pan of biscuits, which required a certain amount of archaeology in the kitchen to locate all the necessary ingredients. The pantry was stocked with the particular logic of a man who buys things in bulk when he has cash and makes them last until he has cash again. Uneven quantities of everything. Small luxuries appearing next to practical necessities with no particular organizing principle. She worked quietly, moving through the kitchen with the focused efficiency she'd developed over years of cooking in difficult circumstances. A father's farmhouse, a boarding house kitchen in Cincinnati, a series of situations she'd navigated by making herself useful before she made herself comfortable. Lydia appeared at the kitchen doorway shortly after she started and stood there watching. "Can I help?" Lydia asked. "Do you know how to peel potatoes?" "Yes." "Then, yes." Lydia came in and took a knife from the correct drawer without being directed to it, a detail that told Mara the girl had done this before, and settled herself at the end of the table and began peeling with practiced focus. They worked in silence for a few minutes. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. "What was it like?" Lydia asked eventually, not looking up from her potato. "Where you came from?" "Ohio," Mara said. "Flat country mostly. Good soil. Different kind of flat from here. Green flat, not brown flat." "Do you miss it?" Mara thought about this honestly, rather than giving the comfortable answer. "I miss certain things about it. My father's farm, the creek behind the property, the way the light fell in the afternoons." She paused. "I don't miss the situation I left." Lydia absorbed this with the focused attention she seemed to apply to most things. "What situation?" Mara considered how much to say to a 9-year-old. "I had a life that stopped fitting me," she said finally, "like a coat that was made for someone else." Lydia considered this. "And you thought a ranch in Montana would fit better?" "I thought I'd try," Mara said. Trying seemed better than staying. Lydia was quiet for a moment. "Mama said that too," she said, then seemed to realize she'd said something she hadn't intended to say, and focused very intently on her potato. Mara didn't push. She just kept stirring the soup and let the silence settle back around them, warm and unhurried. Supper was the three of them at the kitchen table, a meal that was better than the cornbread Elias had made the previous 600 nights, but still carried a certain awkwardness born of three people who didn't yet know how to inhabit a shared space. Elias ate in the concentrated way of a working man who is accustomed to eating fast, then seemed to remember there was a social dimension to the meal and make deliberate adjustments to his pace. "The soup is good," he said, which she suspected was the most effusive culinary compliment he routinely offered. "There's a good stock of root vegetables in the cellar," she said. "I'll use them before the freeze." He looked up at that. "You know preservation cooking?" "My father was an optimist who planted too much every spring and a realist who didn't want to waste it every fall," she said. "I learned preservation out of necessity." The corner of his mouth moved again. "That's a good kind of learning." "It is," she agreed. Lydia ate her soup with the methodical focus she applied to everything, then looked up. "Do you know other things?" she asked Mara. "Besides cooking." "Lydia," Elias said, with the particular tone of a parent who is nominally correcting a child while actually curious about the answer. "It's a reasonable question," Mara said. "Yes, Lydia, I know quite a few things. Some of them useful, some of them just interesting." "Like what?" Lydia pressed. "I can read a watershed," Mara said. "Topography, the shape of land and how water moves through it. My father taught me. He said understanding water was the most useful thing a person could learn in uncertain country." Elias set down his spoon. His expression shifted, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she had his full attention. Not the politely divided attention of a man managing a social situation, but the focused, concentrated attention of someone who has heard something that matters to him. "Your father was a farmer?" he asked. "He was. Small operation, but he was ingenious about water management. Ohio gets rain regularly, but there were dry years, and he had a system, a whole set of principles, really, that he'd worked out over time about reading the land and finding the water that's in it, even when the sky won't give it to you." Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at his plate, then out the window, then back at her. "The creek on the south edge of the property ran low this summer," he said. "Third dry year in a row. I noticed the grass on the way in," she said. "The color of it." He looked at her sharply. "What did you notice?" "The way it's yellowed on the slope below the west ridge, but not uniformly. There are patches that are still holding green that shouldn't be, given the general dryness. It suggests there may be subsurface movement up there. A spring, possibly, or at least residual groundwater that hasn't fully dried." The kitchen had gone very quiet. Elias was looking at her with an expression she still couldn't entirely decode, though she was beginning to understand the basic grammar of his face. This expression had something in it that she hadn't seen before, something raw and unguarded. There's a spring up there, he said. There was. About 8 years ago, it was the best water source on the property. Then it just, he made a gesture with his hand, went dry, or seemed to. I stopped counting on it. It may not be completely dry, Mara said. Springs like that sometimes go underground. It doesn't mean the water's gone. It just means you have to go deeper to find it. Elias was quiet for a long moment. You really know how to read that? He said finally. My father taught me, she said again. And I've had reasons to practice. Another silence. Lydia had stopped eating and was looking between them with the bright, alert attention of a child who understands that something important is being discussed. It's getting dark, Elias said finally, not as a deflection, but as a simple observation. We can talk about the West Ridge in the morning, when there's light enough to see what we're talking about. All right, Mara said. They finished supper. They washed the dishes, all three of them, Lydia insisting on drying, even though she could barely reach the drying rack. And then Elias took Lydia upstairs for her bedtime routine, which apparently involved 2 stories and a negotiation about how many stories was the correct number. A negotiation Mara could hear fragments of from the kitchen, where she sat with a cup of tea and the particular quiet of a new place that was trying to become familiar. She listened to the house creak and settle in the wind. She looked at the window, which showed her only her own reflection in the dark glass. A plain-faced woman of 32 with a brass compass pin on her lapel, sitting in a kitchen that smelled of potato soup and biscuits, and the particular dustiness of a space that was beginning, slowly, to return to life. She had not expected to feel, on her first night in Red Hollow, anything as uncomplicated as hope, but something that resembled it was present in her chest, tentative and a little surprised at itself, like a plant pushing up through ground that isn't as dead as it looked. She finished her tea. She washed her cup. She climbed the stairs to the small room with the dried wildflowers on the windowsill, and she lay down on the fresh-linened bed, and she listened to the Montana wind move against the glass, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without dreaming of escape. Morning came gray and cold, the way Montana mornings do in late season, with a sky that looked like it couldn't decide between clouds and light and was stalling while it figured it out. Mara was up before either of them. She'd woken at 5, which was her habit, formed by years of needing to be useful before anyone else was watching. She dressed and went downstairs and built up the kitchen fire and put coffee on, and she stood at the kitchen window while the coffee came to heat and watched the property emerge from the pre-dawn gray. The yard, the barn, the outbuildings with their compromised roofs, the kitchen garden with its stubborn little patch of root vegetables, the slope of the land to the west, rising in long, irregular grades toward the mountain ridge. She was looking at the ridge when Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in the process of becoming fully awake, his hair disordered and his shirt buttoned incorrectly by one button. He stopped when he saw her and made a small, briefly self-conscious adjustment of his expression. "You're up early," he said. "I made coffee," she said. "I noticed." He crossed to the stove, poured himself a cup, stood beside her at the window. For a moment, they both looked out at the property in silence. "The ridge," he said after a while. "Yes," she said. "You really think the spring's still in there?" "I think it's worth looking," she said. "If I can get up there today and walk the slope, I can tell you more." He was quiet, drinking his coffee. Outside, the sky was beginning to make its decision, gray lightening toward a cool, pale blue. "People in town will have opinions about it," he said, "if they know I'm digging for a spring that everyone wrote off 8 years ago." "People in town seem to have opinions about most things," she said. He made a short sound, almost a laugh, that she was beginning to understand was his version of genuine amusement. "That's true," he said, "Vivian Crow especially." The name landed in the kitchen with a slight heaviness. She'd heard it already. On the boardwalk, the silver blonde woman with the voice calibrated for public consumption. He must have been desperate. "She doesn't approve of me," Mara said. "She doesn't approve of much," Elias said. "She runs a large cattle operation 3 miles north. She's been running it since her husband died 5 years ago, and she runs it well, but she also—" He paused, looking for the precise word. "She has a particular idea of how things in this valley should be, and she works hard to make sure they stay that way. And I don't fit her idea of how things should be." "No," he said, without sugarcoating it. You don't. Mara nodded. She'd expected as much. Women like Vivian Crow existed in every town she'd ever been in. Women who had achieved something hard-won and who protected their position partly by being very careful about who else was allowed to achieve things nearby. Will it cause problems for the ranch? Mara asked. Her opposition? Elias considered. She has influence. She's on good terms with Judge Hartley, who controls a lot of the land disputes in the county. She has the ear of people who matter. He looked at his coffee cup. But she can't tell me who to bring into my own home. No, Mara agreed, but she can make certain things harder. Yes, he said, she can. They stood in silence for a moment, both aware of the territory they were describing. Not just the terrain of the valley, but the social terrain, the invisible geography of influence and judgment and accumulated power that operates in small communities the way weather operates on open land, invisibly most of the time, and then suddenly, overwhelmingly. Lydia appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, her hair unbrushed and her expression suggesting she'd been awake for a while and had been trying, unsuccessfully, to stay in bed. Is there coffee? She asked, with an expression of extreme hope. You're 9, Elias said. Is there anything else? She amended. Mara smiled. I'll make oatmeal, she said. Lydia sat down at the table with the satisfaction of a person who has successfully negotiated a good outcome. She looked at Mara and then at her father, and then back at Mara, with the attentive eyes of a child who is filing information away for later consideration. Did you sleep all right? Lydia asked Mara. Very well, Mara said. The wind's loud sometimes, Lydia said. It sounds like someone's trying to get in. I didn't mind it, Mara said. It sounded like the house breathing. Lydia looked at her with an expression of complex attention, as if this were a new way of understanding something she'd been trying to understand for a long time. Yes, the girl said quietly. That's exactly what it sounds like. Outside, the Montana sky had finally made its decision. The pale blue was brightening into something clean and wide and cold, and the mountain ridge to the west was catching the first real light of morning. And up there, somewhere in the fold of rock and earth, beneath the ground that everyone else had given up on, something was still moving, still present, still alive. Mara stirred the oatmeal and watched the ridge and said nothing, but she filed it away. The west ridge was steeper than it looked from the kitchen window. Mara found that out the following morning, when she climbed it for the first time with Elias 2 steps behind her, and Lydia told firmly to stay at the house, a directive Lydia accepted with the expression of someone storing a grievance for later use. The trail, if it could be called that, was more of a suggestion, a faint line in the scrub grass where feet had occasionally passed over the years, and the vegetation had given up trying to reclaim the ground. Mara climbed with her eyes moving rather than her feet, reading the slope the way her father had taught her. You don't look for water directly, he'd told her once, crouched beside a dry creek bed in Ohio with his hands in the dust. You look for what water leaves behind when it goes, the color of the soil, the way certain plants grow where others don't, the particular way the ground settles over the years when something has been moving beneath it. She stopped twice on the climb. Once to crouch and examine a patch of earth near a cluster of low shrubs that were holding a color slightly too green for the season. Once to press her palm flat against the ground on a natural shelf of the slope and feel for a long moment with her eyes closed. Elias waited each time without asking questions, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. At the top of the climb, near the abandoned spring, which was indeed dry on the surface, the old stone-ringed pool filled with years of wind-blown sediment, Mara stood and looked back down the slope and then at the ground around her for a long time. You feel anything? Elias asked finally. The shrubs about 40 yards below us, she said, the ones with the small yellow leaves. They're a species that roots deep when the surface water's gone. They follow underground moisture. They're healthier than they should be given the drought. He looked in the direction she was indicating. You think the spring went underground? I think it shifted, she said, possibly during a hard freeze or a small seismic event. There was earthquake activity in this region about 8 years ago, wasn't there? Small, but enough. Elias stared at her. 1902. Small tremor. Nobody paid much attention. That would do it, she said. A shift in the underlying rock could redirect a spring. It doesn't disappear. The water still has to go somewhere. But it moves, and if you're only looking at the surface, it looks like it's simply gone. She walked back to the old spring and crouched at its edge, examining the sediment layer, the particular way the dirt had compacted over the years. She pushed her fingers into the edge of it, into the cooler layer below the surface crust. The soil beneath was slightly damp. Not wet, not obviously so, but not dry either. Not the bone-dry, powdered quality that fully arid ground has. There was something there, a memory of water, or the presence of it very far down. "We'd have to dig," she said, "probably deep, maybe 8-10 feet to start, possibly more. And then we'd need to think about getting it to the lower fields. A channel, most likely, which means more work and materials." Elias was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the ridge, cold and direct. Below them, the valley spread in long, dry browns and yellows, and in the distance she could make out the neighboring ranch properties, a patchwork of struggling land under a sky that had not been generous. "That's a lot of labor for something that might not be there," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It might not be there. I could be wrong." He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him doing the arithmetic. The cost of digging in terms of time, in terms of what other work didn't get done, in terms of the particular kind of hope that is dangerous because you can't afford to lose it. "But you don't think you're wrong," he said. "No," she said. "I don't." He turned and looked out over the valley for a long time. Then he nodded, once, slowly. "I'll think on it," he said. "Let's go back down." It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no. She'd learned, in the 2 weeks since arriving at the Boone Ranch, that with Elias, that gap between the two was usually where decisions were being made. 2 weeks had already taught her more about the ranch than a month of letters could have managed, and most of what she'd learned was harder than she'd anticipated. The physical work was not the hardest part, though it was genuinely hard. Mara had never been afraid of labor. She'd grown up doing it, and the years in Cincinnati had given her a different kind of toughness, the indoor kind, the kind that comes from years of making yourself indispensable in situations where nobody is watching. But ranch work used her body in ways it wasn't prepared for, and she went to bed every night in the first week with her arms aching in specific places she hadn't known had muscles. She learned to feed the cattle in the morning, a process Elias walked her through once with the bare efficiency of a man who had done something so many times it had become impossible to explain. She learned which of the horses could be trusted and which needed to be approached from the left and not the right, and why. She learned that the pump at the side of the house had a particular rhythm to it, 2 slow pulls to prime it, then fast, and that if you didn't do it in that order, it would sulk for 20 minutes. She fixed the porch railing herself on a Wednesday afternoon when the wind was down and Elias was out checking the south fence line. She found the lumber in the barn, found the tools, and worked for 3 hours until it was solid. When Elias came back and saw it, he stood on the porch and tested it with both hands and didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "It needed doing," she said. He looked at the railing for another moment. "It's a better repair than I would have done," he said. She didn't argue with him, but she also didn't downplay it, which seemed important. The curtains she replaced gradually, using fabric from the dry goods store in town on the one occasion she'd made the trip in with Elias for supplies. The parlor furniture she moved back to where it clearly belonged, guided by the slight differences in floorware that showed where the legs had originally stood. She found the empty ceramic vase and put it on the kitchen windowsill with a handful of dried grass tied with twine, because there weren't any flowers, and dried grass was better than nothing. The kitchen garden she tackled over the course of several days, clearing the weeds in stages so it didn't look like a project, just a woman doing something small each morning before the bigger work began. Lydia helped without being asked, the way she seemed to understand what Mara was doing before Mara explained it. "Mama had a good garden," Lydia said one morning, kneeling in the dirt beside her, pulling weeds with the practiced grip of a child who'd done this before. "She must have," Mara said. "She grew everything," Lydia said. "Papa doesn't garden. He says he has enough to think about." "He does have a lot to think about," Mara said. Lydia was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to stay?" she asked, with the directness she deployed occasionally, usually without warning, like a blade appearing in an otherwise ordinary conversation. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the child, who was still focused on the weeds, not looking at her. "I intend to," Mara said. "People say you won't," Lydia said. I heard Mrs. Crow telling someone in town last week that you'd be gone by winter. Mara pulled a stubborn weed free from the damp earth and set it aside. People say a lot of things, she said. I know, Lydia said. I just wanted to know what you say. I say I'm not done with this garden, Mara said, and I haven't tasted all the cornbread variations yet, so I'm staying at least through those. Lydia made a sound that was, Mara was fairly certain, a suppressed laugh. She went back to her weeding, and they worked in companionable quiet. And if the question hadn't been entirely answered, the space between them was warm enough that it didn't seem to matter. Red Hollow made its opinions known in the way small towns always do. Not in a single confrontation, but in the accumulated weight of small moments, each one deniable on its own, collectively impossible to mistake. The women at the dry goods store who went quiet when Mara entered and resumed talking when she left. The way she was made to wait longer than other customers at the feed store. A small cruelty administered through the pretense of busyness. The fact that the church social she was technically invited to, because newly arrived wives were always technically invited, felt like a room that had been carefully arranged to leave no space for her. She went once. She stood near the edge of the gathering with a cup of cider she hadn't been offered but had quietly taken from the table herself, and she talked to two older women who seemed genuinely neutral about her existence. And she watched Vivian Crow hold court at the center of the room with the ease of someone who has been the most important person in that room for so long that the room has shaped itself around her. Vivian was not, Mara acknowledged privately, a simple villain. She was a woman who ran a 300-head cattle operation alone and did it well. Elias had said as much, without particular admiration, but without dishonesty either. She was someone who'd earned her position in the valley through real work and real competence, and who had decided, with the certainty of the truly powerful, that the space she controlled should not be disrupted by elements she hadn't approved. Mara was an element she hadn't approved. They met directly only once in those first weeks, in the middle of the main street in Red Hollow on a Saturday afternoon. Mara was carrying a sack of flour from the dry goods store. Vivian was coming out of the bank, accompanied by a woman Mara recognized as the wife of the town's largest property owner. Vivian stopped. She looked at Mara with the particular kind of assessment that certain women deploy, full and immediate, taking in everything from the hem of the dress to the set of the jaw. And she smiled. It was a beautiful smile, and it meant nothing good. Mrs. Boone, Vivian said, with the slight emphasis on the name that suggested it still sat oddly. How are you settling in? Well enough, Mara said. The ranch must be quite an adjustment, Vivian said, her voice carrying the warm, carrying quality of a woman who had learned to project concern in public spaces. After wherever you came from. Ohio, wasn't it? Yes. Such a different landscape. Vivian tilted her head. Are you finding the work manageable? I imagine it's quite a change for a woman of your, a brief pause, exquisitely timed, background. The woman beside her made a small sound that was technically not a laugh. Mara looked at Vivian Crow steadily. She'd been on the receiving end of this kind of conversation before, the kind where every sentence is a blade wrapped in silk, and the only winning move is to not acknowledge the blade. I'm finding it very manageable, thank you, she said. The property has a lot of potential. She paused just a beat. The West Ridge especially. Something flickered across Vivian's face. Brief, contained, but present. The West Ridge meant the spring, and the spring meant water, and water in a drought year was the kind of subject that carried weight. That spring has been dry for 8 years, Vivian said, and her voice was slightly less warm now, slightly more direct. Springs go underground sometimes, Mara said. It doesn't mean the water's gone. They looked at each other for a moment, and in the look there was a communication that had nothing to do with springs. It was the older kind of exchange between two women who understand exactly what the other is and exactly what is at stake. How interesting, Vivian said finally. Her smile returned, unchanged. Do give my regards to Elias. She moved past. Her companion moved with her. Mara stood on the boardwalk with her flour sack and watched them go, and noted without particular drama that the exchange had been a declaration of something, though she wasn't yet sure of exactly what. Elias made his decision about the spring on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after they'd walked the ridge together. He'd spent those 3 weeks watching the South Creek, which had dropped another 2 inches in the drought heat. He'd spent them doing his own reading of the slope from the ground, coming and going from the barn each morning and evening with his eyes on the ridge. He hadn't talked about it much. That was his way, to think something through privately until it was decided, and then to announce the decision rather than the process. He came in from the evening feeding and stood in the kitchen doorway while Mara was finishing supper, and he said without preamble, "We're going to dig." She turned from the stove. "The spring?" "The spring." He sat down at the table with the particular heaviness of a man who has made a decision he's not entirely sure about and is now committed to it. "I want to try your way. All of it. The digging, the channel if we find water, the whole plan." Mara set the spoon down. "I'll need to survey the slope properly first. Mark where I think we should dig." "I figured. And we'll need help. It's too much for two people alone." He nodded slowly. "I know a few men who might work for wages. And maybe—" He stopped. "What?" "There are a few ranchers in the valley who've been watching their own water situation. If the spring is what you think it is, if there's enough water, it would help more than just us." He looked at the table. "I thought about approaching them, asking if they'd contribute labor in exchange for water rights, if we find it." Mara looked at him. It was a better idea than what she'd been developing on her own, and it was his idea, offered in the slightly careful way of a man who has learned not to assume his ideas will be welcome. "That's a very good plan," she said. He looked up. He seemed, for a moment, slightly surprised by the directness of her agreement. "You think it would work?" he asked. "If the spring is there, the water would be enough for the whole valley," she said. "More than enough. Sharing it makes more sense than hoarding it, and offering the labor for water exchange means we don't have to pay wages we don't have." She paused. "Who did you have in mind?" "Harlan Taft, maybe. He's 2 miles south. Good man, honest. His east pasture's barely surviving. And the Gruber brothers, Carl and Otto, they run a mixed operation about 3 miles west. They're practical enough to consider it." "Not Vivian Crow?" Mara said. Something in Elias's expression shifted. Subtle, but she caught it. "Vivian has her own well, and she's protective of it. She won't be an early ally in this." "But she'd be a problem if it works," Mara said. "She'd be a problem either way," Elias said. "The difference is, if it works, she'll have less leverage." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and in the look was the recognition, the first real one, Mara thought, that they were thinking about things together. Not him explaining to her, or her explaining to him, but two people looking at the same problem from the same side. It was a small thing. But in the context of a practical marriage between two people who were still largely strangers to each other, it was not nothing. "There's one more thing," Elias said. He was looking at the table again, which was where he looked when he was about to say something that cost him something. "If this doesn't work, if we dig and there's nothing there, it won't be just money we've lost. People are watching. Vivian is watching. They'll say, 'I let you convince me into a bad gamble.'" He paused. "They'll say worse things about you." "I know," Mara said, "and you still think we should do it." "I think the creek will be dry by March if we don't," she said. "And a known loss is worse than an uncertain gamble." He looked up at her then with an expression that had something new in it. Something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was the specific precursor to it. The moment before trust, when you realize you're about to take the weight off your own shoulders and put it partly on someone else's. And you don't know yet whether they'll hold it. "All right," he said. Lydia appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, having apparently been listening from the stairs with the total absence of guilt that characterized her approach to information gathering. "Are we doing the spring?" she asked. "You were supposed to be in bed," Elias said. "I was on my way," Lydia said. "Are we doing the spring?" "We're going to try," Mara said. Lydia looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "Good," she said. "I knew you'd figure it out." She said it with the absolute confidence of someone delivering information rather than an opinion, and then she turned and went back up the stairs before anyone could respond. Elias stared at the empty doorway for a moment. "She was listening the whole time," he said. "Probably," Mara agreed. He shook his head slowly, but it was the kind of head shaking that was really just suppressed affection, wearing a different expression. He got up from the table and took his coffee cup to the washstand. The kitchen was warm and the fire was burning low, and outside the Montana dark was complete, in the way it could only be complete out here, miles from anything that made light. I'll talk to Harlan tomorrow, Elias said. I'll survey the ridge in the morning, Mara said. He nodded. He moved toward the door, then stopped. He stood for a moment with his back to her in the particular way of someone who has something else to say and is deciding whether to say it. Thank you, he said, not loudly, not with any particular ceremony. You haven't thanked me for anything yet, she said. We haven't done anything yet. I know, he said. I meant for... He made a brief, slightly helpless gesture that encompassed, she thought, the kitchen and the soup and the porch railing and the garden and the curtains and the 9 mornings of oatmeal and the specific, consistent way she'd been present in a house that hadn't had presence in it for a long time. She didn't say anything. She turned back to the stove and finished putting things away, and she listened to his footsteps on the stairs, and she stood in the kitchen of the Boone Ranch in the dark Montana night and let herself feel, without commentary, the particular weight of a life that was becoming real. The drought was still tightening. The ridge was still waiting. Vivian Crow was still watching from her well-watered position 3 miles north, certain of the failure she'd already predicted. And Mara Ellison, Mara Boone technically, though she hadn't yet settled into the name, stood in a kitchen she'd made functional again, in a house she'd started to bring back to life, thinking about water and rock and the particular stubbornness of things that aren't as dead as they look. She wasn't afraid exactly, but she understood the stakes clearly enough to be honest about them, which was something her father had always said was more useful than confidence. Know what you're risking, he'd told her once, then decide anyway. She turned off the lamp. She went upstairs. Tomorrow, she was going to survey the ridge. Harlan Taft said yes on the first asking, which surprised Elias and didn't surprise Mara. She'd met Harlan twice before the conversation happened, once in town, where he'd nodded at her without the particular loaded quality that most nods in Red Hollow carried, and once when he'd come to the Boone Ranch to return a borrowed fence post driver and had stood in the yard talking to Elias about the drought with the focused, unsentimental attention of a man who was looking at real numbers and didn't like what they added up to. He was somewhere in his 50s, lean and sun-worn, with the kind of face that had stopped caring about impressions a long time ago and was purely functional now. When Elias laid out the plan, the spring, the digging, the channel, the water for labor arrangement, Harlan listened without interrupting, which was rare in Mara's experience of men being presented with other people's ideas. Your wife's the one figured this out, he said when Elias finished. She read the slope, Elias said, the soil, the plants. Her father taught her water management. Harlan looked at Mara directly. You think it's there? I think the evidence points to it being there, she said. I won't tell you it's a certainty because I can't know that until we dig, but the indicators are consistent. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my East Creek is 4 inches below where it was this time last year. My cattle are starting to show it. He looked at Elias. When do you start? The Gruber brothers took 3 days and a longer conversation. Carl was cautious by nature, the kind of man who wanted to understand a thing fully before committing to it, and Mara spent the better part of an afternoon at the Gruber kitchen table going through everything she knew, the geology, the plant behavior, the soil samples she'd taken from the ridge, the reasoning her father had taught her. Carl asked questions throughout, some of them good ones that she had to think about before answering. His brother Otto mostly listened and then, at the end, said, I believe her. Let's do it. And that settled it. There were 2 other ranchers who came in before the digging started. Men Harlan brought in, neighbors of his who'd heard what was being planned and showed up at the Boone property on a Tuesday morning with shovels and a kind of desperate willingness that told Mara everything she needed to know about how bad the drought had gotten in the valley. Their names were Prewitt and Sandoval, and they didn't have much to say to her directly, but they were there, which mattered more than conversation. 6 men total, counting Elias, plus Mara, who had no intention of directing from the bottom of the hill. Vivian Crow's response to the news arrived before the digging did, in the form of a comment delivered at the Red Hollow General Store on the same Tuesday, overheard by Otto Gruber's wife, and reported back to Mara by Lydia, who had her own information network that operated with impressive efficiency for a 9-year-old. Mrs. Crow said you're going to dig up the Boone Ranch looking for water in a spring that's been dead since '02, Lydia reported, sitting on the porch railing with her legs swinging, and that when you don't find anything, Papa will be out of labor and money, and the ranch will be in a worse position than it is now, and that everyone who joined in deserves what they get for listening to a woman who doesn't know this valley. Mara listened to this without expression. Is that all she said? Lydia considered. She also said something about Ohio that I didn't fully understand, but I don't think it was a compliment. Probably not. Lydia stopped swinging her legs. Are you scared? She asked. Mara thought about how to answer that honestly without performing either bravery or vulnerability. I'm concerned, she said, so there's a difference. Scared means you stop. Concerned means you check your reasoning twice. Did you check your reasoning twice? I checked it about 11 times, Mara said. Lydia nodded, satisfied. Then you're probably right, she said, and got down from the railing and went inside, apparently having settled the matter to her own satisfaction. They started digging on a Wednesday at dawn. Mara had marked the site the previous week, not at the old spring, which was where everyone assumed they'd dig, but 30 yards below it and slightly west, at a spot she'd identified by the convergence of 3 separate indicators: the depth and health of the yellow-leafed shrubs, a particular softness in the soil that persisted even in the current dry conditions, and a subtle depression in the terrain that suggested settling over something below. She'd explained this to Elias the night before in the kitchen, with a rough diagram she'd drawn on the back of an envelope, and he'd looked at the diagram for a long time and then looked at her. If you're wrong about the location, we lose a week just on this spot before we can try somewhere else, he said. I know, she said. I'm not wrong about the location. He folded the envelope and put it in his shirt pocket. Whether that was trust or just decision, she wasn't entirely sure. The digging itself was worse than any of them had fully anticipated, which was probably the only realistic outcome when 6 people attempt to go 10 feet into a Montana hillside in autumn. The first 3 feet came out relatively easily: loose soil and dry clay, the kind of ground that yields to a shovel without much argument. Below that, the ground changed character. It became harder, more compacted, laced with rocks that ranged from inconvenient to completely immovable without a pry bar. They worked in shifts, 2 people in the pit at a time, while the others rested, hauled dirt, or dealt with the rocks that needed to be moved aside rather than lifted out. Mara worked every shift she could without making a point of it. She just appeared at the edge of the pit when it was time and went down and worked, and nobody said anything about it, which was the right response. On the 3rd day, Carl Gruber's shoulder gave him trouble, an old injury from years back that the digging had aggravated, and he came up from the pit with his face set in the particular expression of a man trying not to show pain and not entirely succeeding. He sat on the hillside with his back against a boulder and watched the work continue with the frustrated dignity of someone who is not built for inactivity. It's still there, Mara told him, sitting beside him during a water break. The ground changed at about 7 feet, did you notice? He looked at her sidelong. The color of it. Yes, darker. More moisture in the soil matrix even down here. We're getting closer. He was quiet for a moment. My grandfather came out here from Pennsylvania in 1867, he said. Built the operation from nothing. 3 generations of Grubers on that land. He looked at his hands. I'm not going to lose it to a dry spell if there's any alternative. There's an alternative, Mara said. He nodded once and didn't say anything else, and she went back to the work. The 5th day was when doubt started to do serious damage. Prewitt and Sandoval came up from the pit at noon on the 5th day and stood together at the top of the ridge with an entirely different quality of silence than they'd been carrying before. They'd gone down into a pit that was now 9 feet deep and had hit a layer of dense rock that the pry bars were barely moving. The rock wasn't bedrock. Mara had been clear about that, had shown them the geological reasoning, but it was thick and it was hard, and it was directly in the way of where the water should be. I need to say something, Prewitt said to Elias, not loudly but not privately either. He was a direct man, which Mara had assessed early on and respected even now, when the directness was working against her. We've been at this 5 days. We've moved a lot of earth and a lot of rock, and we're not at water yet. I've got a property to maintain and livestock to tend, and I can't stay on this hillside indefinitely based on a theory. Elias looked at him steadily. Nobody's holding you here. I know that, Prewitt said. I'm just being honest about where I stand. Sandoval said nothing, but his posture said the same thing. Mara set down the sledgehammer she'd been using on the rock layer and straightened up and looked at them both. Her arms ached with a depth that had become constant enough that she'd stopped registering it as new information. Her hands had blisters that had become calluses over the course of the week. She was tired in a way that sleep only partially addressed. "The rock layer is approximately 2 feet thick," she said, "based on what I'm seeing in the composition of what we've already removed. Below it, if I'm reading this correctly, there should be a permeable layer where the water's been collecting." She looked at both of them. "I'm not asking you to take it on faith. I'm telling you what the evidence says. What you do with that is your decision." Prewitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the pit. Then he looked at the cloudless sky above them, which had been providing exactly nothing in the way of rain for 3 weeks now. 2 feet of that rock," he said. "How long?" 2 more days, she said. "Maybe 3. He picked up his pry bar. 2 more days, he said, and went back down into the pit. Sandoval followed without saying anything, which Mara understood as agreement. She exchanged a brief look with Elias, who was standing 6 feet away with his arms crossed. His face was controlled, but she knew enough of him by now to read the things his face was trying not to show. 2 more days, he said quietly. "You're sure?" "I'm sure about the rock thickness," she said. "I'm as sure as I can be about the rest." "That's not quite the same thing." "No," she said. "It's not." He picked up his pry bar and went down into the pit, and she followed him. The 6th day was the hardest, not physically, but in every other way. By mid-afternoon, the mood on the ridge had shifted in a way that was impossible to miss. Men who had been working with purpose were now working with endurance, which is a different thing. Purpose has direction in it. Endurance is just forward motion with all the hope taken out. The rock layer was proving thicker than Mara had estimated, or they were moving through it more slowly than she'd calculated. And by late afternoon, the margin between her 2-day prediction and the current reality was beginning to be visible. Nobody said it out loud, but she could feel it in the way the conversation had thinned, in the way Prewitt had started checking the angle of the sun with increasing frequency, in the way even Harlan Taft, who had been the most steadily present person on the ridge, had gone very quiet. Elias came up from the pit at dusk and stood beside Mara at the edge of the excavation and looked down into it for a long time. In the fading light, the cut earth was red and dense, and the rock at the bottom gleamed dully. "If tomorrow doesn't get us through," he said quietly, "we're going to lose them." "I know. Prewitt will leave, probably Sandoval too." "I know. And then it's just us and Harlan and the Grubers, and that's not enough labor to—" "Elias." She said it quietly, not to cut him off, but to stop the momentum of the calculation, which was taking them somewhere they didn't need to go yet. "Tomorrow is tomorrow. Let's not bury ourselves tonight with what hasn't happened." He looked at her. In the last of the daylight, his face was tired in a way that went below the physical, the exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that he's stopped being sure he can put it down. "I keep thinking about what happens if—" he started. "I know what you keep thinking about," she said. "You've been thinking about it since we started. Maybe before." He was quiet. "So have I," she said. "But I went back through everything twice more last night. The reasoning is sound. The water is there." He looked down at the pit again. "You can't know that for certain." "No," she said. "I can't. But I know the earth, and I know water, and I know this slope. And I've been wrong before in my life, but I haven't been wrong about this kind of thing yet." She paused. "My father taught me well. I trust what he taught me." It was the most she'd ever said directly about her father, or about trust, or about the particular internal architecture of her own confidence. She wasn't sure why she'd said it now. Maybe because the moment called for it. Maybe because Elias needed to understand where her certainty came from. Not from stubbornness or performance, but from a genuine inheritance, something handed down and tested and proven over years before she ever arrived in this valley. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He put his hand over hers briefly, and then took it away. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. It wasn't romantic exactly, or it wasn't only that. It was more like an acknowledgement. 2 people standing at the edge of something difficult, recognizing each other. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow." Wasem. The 7th day broke cold, with a thin overcast that made the light flat and gray, and gave the ridge a bleak, exhausted quality that matched the mood of the men working on it. Mara was down in the pit by 6 in the morning, working the rock layer with a short-handled pick because the angle required it. The rock here was different from what they'd been through above, fractured in places, with hairline cracks that suggested weakness, that suggested the possibility of giving. She worked the cracks methodically, driving the pick into them, leveraging the fracture points, communicating with the rock the way her father had taught her to communicate with the earth, not forcing it, but finding where it wanted to move and helping it move there. Otto Gruber came down at 7 and worked beside her without conversation, which was his way and which she'd come to appreciate. He was a large man, and his movements were powerful and deliberate, and the two of them working in the confined space of the pit had a rhythm to it by now. The kind of rhythm that develops between people who have been doing physical work alongside each other long enough that they've stopped thinking about each other and just become part of the same motion. At just past 8, Mara's pick found a crack that didn't stop. She felt it before she understood it. A different quality of resistance. A give in the rock that was more than mechanical. She struck again in the same place. The crack widened. She could feel the change in the air at the bottom of the pit, something cooler and different touching the back of her hand where it held the pick. "Otto," she said. He stopped. He looked at her, then at the crack in the rock. She struck again. A section of rock the size of a dinner plate shifted. She got the pry bar into the crack and leaned on it with her full weight, and the rock moved, and beneath it was a different kind of darkness than the earth above it. A wetness, a smell of deep cold water that she knew the way you know something you've been waiting for. "Otto," she said again, differently. He was already moving. "Elias!" he shouted, looking up over the edge of the pit. "Elias, get down here!" She didn't wait. She drove the pry bar in again, and another section of rock fractured and came loose, and the darkness below it was wet and growing, and she could hear it now. A sound so quiet she might have imagined it, a movement of water below stone, something that had been pressing against this ceiling for years and years, waiting. She hit it twice more. The rock gave way. The water didn't burst through dramatically, not at first. It came up as a welling, a dark spreading dampness that climbed through the broken rock and reached her knees before she fully registered what was happening. She stood in the pit with water rising around her boots, and Otto Gruber grabbing her arm to pull her up, and the sound from below growing from a whisper to something unmistakable. And she looked at the water coming up through the fractured stone of the Montana hillside and felt a sensation in her chest that she couldn't have named with any precision, but that was something close to the specific relief of a person who has been right about something important when the cost of being wrong was very high. By the time Elias got down into the pit, the water was ankle deep and rising. He stood in it and looked at it and then looked at her, and his face did something she'd never seen it do before. It opened. All the controlled, careful management of expression that she'd spent 7 weeks learning to read simply fell away for a moment, and underneath it was a man who was experiencing something too big to keep composed about. He didn't say anything. He looked at the water and then at her, and he pressed his lips together hard, and she understood that he was not going to be able to speak for a moment, and she didn't require him to. From above them she could hear the voices of the men, Harlan's low, startled exclamation, Pruitt saying something short and sharp that might have been an oath or might have been a prayer, Carl Gruber shouting for his brother, Sandoval laughing in the sudden, involuntary way of a man who hadn't expected to feel like laughing. She climbed out of the pit. She stood at the top of the ridge and looked down into it, where the water was still rising, still finding its level, still announcing itself after 8 years of going nowhere that anyone could find. Harlan stood beside her. He was looking at the water with the expression of a man who has been in this valley for 30 years and has made his peace with hard luck and harder work and is now confronted with something that contradicts the conclusions he'd arrived at. "I'll be damned," he said, quietly and with conviction. "It'll need channeling," Mara said. Her voice was steady, though the rest of her wasn't entirely. "The slope gives us a natural grade to work with. If we build the channel along the east contour of the ridge, we can get water to the lower pastures of every property within 2 miles without much additional elevation change." Harlan looked at her with an expression that had entirely shed the cautious assessment of their early acquaintance. "You've already worked out the channel." "I've been thinking about it since the second day," she said. He almost smiled. "Of course you have." Elias climbed out of the pit and stood beside her, wet to the knees, and together they looked down the slope at the valley below. at the dry brown land, at the struggling properties, at the country that had been slowly losing its argument with the drought for 3 consecutive years. "We need to share it," Mara said. She said it quietly, not as a directive, but as a statement of what she understood to be true. "All of it, the whole valley." Elias turned to look at her, including the properties that had nothing to do with this. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Including the ones that said it wouldn't work." "Yes." Another moment. "Including Vivian Crow's operation." Mara looked at him directly. "Especially those," she said. "Because if we keep it for ourselves, it's just water. If we share it, it's something else." He held her gaze for a long time. She could see the practicality in him working through it. The man who'd been stretched thin for years, who had legitimate claim to this discovery, who had carried the cost of it, working through the calculation and arriving somewhere else. "Something else," he repeated. "Something that changes how this valley sees things," she said, "including how it sees us." He looked out over the valley again. The water was audible now even from the ridgetop, a sound that hadn't been in this place for 8 years, moving through the broken rock and into the world. "All right," he said. "We share it." Prewitt, standing nearby and having heard most of this, made a sound that was entirely involuntary. He looked at Mara with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, something that was working its way, awkwardly and with visible effort, toward the shape of respect. "My east pasture borders the Crow property," he said after a moment. "If you want, I can talk to her foreman about access for the channel line." Mara looked at him. "I'd appreciate that," she said. He nodded, in the short, committed way of a man who has made a decision he's going to have to live with and is already living with it. "You were right," he said, "about the spring. Wanted to say so directly." "Thank you," she said. He went back to looking at the water, and she did too, and for a while nobody said anything because there wasn't anything to say that the sound of the water wasn't already saying better. The channel work took 2 more days, and it was in some ways harder than the digging had been, more precise, more technical, requiring the kind of sustained attention that doesn't have the drama of breaking through stone, but demands more from the brain. Mara walked the grade 3 times before she committed the line to stakes in the ground, checking her calculations, checking them again, adjusting twice for features of the terrain she'd initially underestimated. Lydia appeared on the ridge on the afternoon of the second channel day, having apparently decided that the directive to stay at the house no longer applied now that there was water involved. She stood at the top of the excavation and looked at the spring with an expression of profound satisfaction, and then she walked along the staked channel line the way she walked along most things, with the focused, proprietary attention of someone who already considers it hers. "It goes all the way to Harlan's property?" she asked Mara. "With a branch line to the Grubers and the main channel continuing south to Prewitt's pastures," Mara said, "if the slope cooperates." "Does the slope cooperate?" "Mostly," Mara said. Lydia looked at the ridge, at the water, at the line of stakes disappearing down the hill. Then she looked at Mara with an expression that was trying to be casual and wasn't quite managing it. "Are people going to be different now?" she asked. "In town?" Mara considered this honestly. "Some of them," she said. "Not all of them." "Vivian Crow?" "That one," Mara said carefully. "I genuinely don't know." Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She was at the general store again. I heard she told Mrs. Hartley that finding water doesn't change who you are." Mara kept her eyes on the channel line. "She's right about that," she said. Lydia looked at her sharply. "Finding the water doesn't change who I am," Mara said. "I was who I was before we dug. The water just—" She paused, looking for the right word. "It just made it visible." Lydia considered this for a while. The wind came across the ridge and moved through her hair, and she didn't push it back, just let it blow. "I think people are going to be different," she said finally, with the settled certainty she usually reserved for facts she considered self-evident, whether they want to be or not. Mara looked at the child standing on the Montana ridge in the autumn wind, 9 years old and already carrying a kind of bone-deep clarity about the way the world worked that most people spent their whole lives trying to arrive at. "You might be right," she said. The water moved down the new channel in the late afternoon light, finding its grade, following the slope, heading toward the dry land below with the patient, Inevitable quality of water that has somewhere to go and has been waiting a long time to get there. On the valley floor, far below, the Boone cattle had found the lower edge of the new channel line where the ground was wet for the first time in months, and they stood at it in the way cattle stand at water, with the particular stillness of animals that have stopped asking for something and are finally receiving it. Mara stood on the ridge and watched, and did not let herself think about Vivian Crow or the harvest festival that was 3 weeks away, or the conversation she could already see coming at the edge of the future like weather moving in from the west. She let herself have this moment first. The water, the valley, the long shadow of the ridge falling across the dry country below, and a spring that everyone had given up on running clean and cold through the broken earth of a Montana autumn. She had been right. It mattered. She let it matter. Then she went back to work. The 3 weeks between the spring and the harvest festival were the strangest of Mara's time in Red Hollow, because they were the weeks in which the town began, slowly and without any particular grace, to change its mind about her. It didn't happen the way it does in stories, where a dramatic event produces an immediate reversal, and people who were cruel become suddenly warm, and the world reorganizes itself around a new understanding. It happened the way most real changes happen, incrementally, awkwardly, with a lot of people making small adjustments to their behavior while carefully not acknowledging that any adjustment was occurring. Harlan Taft was the first. He came by the Boone Ranch the week after the channel was complete, ostensibly to check the water flow at the junction point on his property line, and he stood in the yard afterward talking to Elias for 20 minutes about cattle management and fence repair, and at the end of it he looked at Mara and said, "My wife would like to have you to supper sometime, if you're willing." He said it plainly, without ceremony, the way he said most things. She didn't come to the social. She doesn't go to many of those. But she's a good cook, and she'd like to meet you properly. "I'd like that," Mara said. He nodded and left, and Elias watched the wagon go with an expression Mara had learned to read as something processing itself beneath the surface. "Harlan Taft has never once suggested supper to anyone," Elias said. "I gathered," Mara said. The Grubers came by 2 days later, both of them, with Carl's wife Hannah, who brought a jar of preserved plums and a handshake so firm it rearranged Mara's fingers temporarily. Hannah Gruber was a practical woman in her 40s who had apparently decided, based on whatever internal calculus she applied to such assessments, that Mara was worth knowing. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and asked direct questions about the Ohio farming operation and the water management techniques, and whether Mara thought the channel could be extended further south if next year was dry too. They talked for 2 hours. Hannah left with the specific energy of someone who had found something she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. Prewitt stopped Mara on the street in Red Hollow on a Saturday and tipped his hat, which was a small thing but was not nothing. Even Sandoval, who had never been particularly talkative, made a point of saying good morning when their paths crossed at the feed store, and said it loud enough that the 2 men standing nearby heard him do it. None of this reached Vivian Crow's particular circle, which remained intact and cool and watched all of it from a careful distance. The silver-blonde woman was present at the periphery of several of these exchanges without being part of them, and Mara was aware, each time, of being observed with the particular attention of someone who is reassessing a situation they thought they had fully mapped. The water had been this complication Vivian hadn't anticipated, not its existence. She'd been wrong about the spring, and Mara suspected that Vivian Crow processed being wrong about things by immediately finding a different angle from which to reassert her position rather than by anything as straightforward as admitting error. The complication was the sharing. Mara had been told, through the informal relay system of Valley gossip that Lydia monitored with professional dedication, that Vivian's own foreman had accepted the channel water access for the southern edge of the Crow property, practically, because it would benefit the livestock and the man was sensible, and that this had created a situation where Vivian was materially benefiting from something Mara had done, which was a fact that clearly sat in her like a stone she couldn't shift. "She's going to do something at the festival," Lydia said, 3 days before it. They were in the kitchen after supper, Lydia ostensibly doing her school reading and actually conducting what Mara had come to think of as her ongoing social analysis of Red Hollow. Elias was outside checking the barn by lamplight. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the apple preserves Mara had made that afternoon, the jars lined up on the counter still holding their heat. "What makes you think that?" Mara asked, not dismissively. She'd learned to take Lydia's assessment seriously. Because she hasn't done anything yet, Lydia said. And she always does something. She just waits until there's an audience big enough to matter. Mara looked at the child over the rim of her coffee cup. That's a fairly sophisticated observation. I've been watching her for years, Lydia said. She did the same thing with the Hendersons 3 years ago when Mr. Henderson tried to dispute the grazing boundary. She waited until the 4th of July celebration and then said something in front of everyone about his property being mismanaged. He was humiliated enough that he dropped the dispute. She turned a page of her book without reading it. She uses audiences. What do you think she'll say? Lydia was quiet for a moment. Something about you not really belonging here. Something about the marriage being desperate on Papa's side. Something that's technically not a lie, but is meant to make you feel like nothing. She paused. She's good at finding the thing that hurts the most and saying it like she's just making an observation. The accuracy of this assessment was such that Mara sat with it for a moment without speaking. I'll be fine, she said. Lydia looked at her with the expression she wore when she considered an answer insufficient. I know you'll be fine, she said. I just wanted you to be ready, Sam. The Red Hollow Harvest Festival occupied the town's main street and the adjacent field on the last Saturday of October, which in Montana meant a sky the color of cold iron and a wind that arrived in gusts and left again and arrived once more, unpredictably, carrying the first real suggestion of winter. Tables ran the length of the street. There were lanterns, and a fiddle player setting up near the old livery, and the smell of roasting corn and wood smoke that Mara would later associate, for the rest of her life, with that particular afternoon. She wore her better dress. She had two, and this was the one she kept for occasions that required the acknowledgement that occasions existed. It was a deep blue-gray, not new but well-maintained, and she'd pinned her father's compass at the collar. Lydia had decided, that morning, that her hair should be braided differently, and had spent 20 minutes attempting a style she'd apparently seen somewhere and only partially understood, producing a result that was slightly lopsided but that Mara had declined to correct, because Lydia's expression of concentrated effort while doing it had been something she didn't want to interrupt. Elias wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard, and he walked into the festival beside her and Lydia with the particular set of his shoulders that she'd come to understand meant he was prepared for something he'd rather not be prepared for. The first hour was manageable. Hannah Gruber found her immediately and pulled her into a conversation with two women Mara hadn't met, both of them wives of valley ranchers, both of them carrying the specific warmth of people who have already formed a positive opinion and are now confirming it in person. Harlan Taft's wife turned out to be a small, quiet woman named Bess, who shook Mara's hand and said, "Harlan talks about you," in a tone that made it clear this was unusual and meant something. Lydia disappeared into the cluster of children with the speed of someone who has been contained too long, reappearing periodically to eat something from a table and then disappearing again. Elias stayed close without being obvious about staying close, which she understood and appreciated. Vivian arrived an hour into the festival, which was its own kind of statement. The arrival calibrated for maximum visibility, at the hour when the crowd had assembled enough to constitute the audience she required. She came with two women from town, dressed in the particular way that communicated that she had not made an effort while having made a very significant effort, and she moved through the festival the way she moved through everything, as if the space had been arranged for her convenience. She worked her way toward Mara gradually, which was also a technique. There were greetings, conversations, the slow drift of someone who appears to be circulating casually and is doing nothing of the kind. Mara tracked it in her peripheral vision without turning to face it, the way you track weather moving in from a known direction. When Vivian finally arrived beside her, it was at a moment when Mara happened to be standing slightly apart from the group she'd been talking to, having stepped back to give Bess Taft room to demonstrate something about a preserving technique with her hands. The timing was exact enough to confirm Lydia's assessment entirely. Mrs. Boone. Vivian's voice carried the warmth of a woman performing pleasantness for an audience that was, without obviously watching. What a lovely festival. Are you enjoying yourself? Very much, Mara said. It must be quite something after a slight pause, the brief performance of trying to remember. Ohio, was it? To be part of a real community gathering. Ohio had community gatherings, Mara said pleasantly. Of course, Vivian smiled. I only meant that this must feel particularly significant given how things started when you arrived. She looked around the crowd with a kind of fond assessment. Red Hollow can be slow to warm to newcomers, especially those who arrive under particular circumstances. The women with Vivian were listening. Several people nearby had the attentive stillness of people who are pretending not to listen and are listening completely. The spring must have helped, Vivian continued. Practical results have a way of making people more accepting, even when the personal situation is, another pause, a small, careful tilt of the head, complicated. What personal situation is complicated? Mara asked. She kept her voice level and genuinely curious sounding, which required a certain amount of internal management. Vivian's expression didn't change. It was too practiced to change at something so direct. Well, a mail order arrangement isn't the most conventional beginning, and Elias has been struggling for years. I imagine he was quite desperate for help in whatever form it took. There it was. Precisely as Lydia had predicted, technically not a lie, constructed to reduce Mara to a practical acquisition made by a desperate man, removing from the entire picture any suggestion that she was there as a person worth wanting, that the marriage had any dimension beyond transaction, that she herself had value independent of her utility. The nearby conversations had gone quiet in the particular way that indicated the surrounding people had stopped pretending not to listen. Mara opened her mouth. She didn't get to say anything. That's not true. The voice was small and absolutely certain and came from approximately waist height. Lydia had appeared from somewhere, from the crowd, from thin air, from the particular place children appear from when they are needed, and was standing directly between Mara and Vivian with her chin up and her dark eyes carrying all the focused intensity of a person who has been waiting for a moment and has arrived at it. Lydia, Elias said, from somewhere behind Mara. He'd materialized as well, which meant he'd been closer than she'd realized. It's not true, Lydia said again, looking at Vivian with the complete unself-conscious directness of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of powerful adults and may never learn. Papa wasn't desperate. He was lonely and he was sad and the ranch was hard, but he wasn't desperate. He wrote to Mara because he thought she might be, she paused, searching for the word, the right kind of person. And she is. She came here and she fixed the porch and she learned all our chickens' names and she found the water when everyone said there wasn't any. And she did it because she wanted to help us, not because she was trying to get something. Her voice was perfectly steady. And we love her. And you don't get to say she doesn't belong here. The street was quiet enough that the fiddle player, who had paused, was audible doing nothing. Vivian looked at the child with an expression that was working through several adjustments simultaneously. Whatever response she'd prepared for the festival had not included a 9-year-old girl making a direct statement in a crowd of people who were now entirely focused on the exchange. Elias stepped forward until he was beside Mara. He looked at Vivian, and then he looked around at the people gathered, at Harlan and Bess Taft, at the Gruber brothers, at Prewitt and Sandoval, at the dozen other faces he'd known for years, people who'd watched his farm struggle and his daughter grow up without a mother, and who now stood holding their festival cups and their plates of food in the October wind. He spoke without raising his voice, which meant everyone had to be quiet to hear him, which meant everyone was quiet. Mara came here as a stranger, he said. I wrote to her because I needed help and I didn't know another way to ask for it. That part is true. What's not true is that it stayed that way. He paused. She repaired this ranch with her own hands. She rebuilt my daughter's life in ways I couldn't manage on my own. She read a slope that every experienced rancher in this valley had written off, and she was right about it, and then she gave the water to everyone instead of keeping it. She's done more for this valley in 4 months than most people do in a lifetime of living here. He stopped. Let that settle. And she did it while most of you were deciding whether she was worth talking to. The crowd was very still. She's my wife, Elias said, and she's the best person I know. And if anyone in this town has something to say about that, I'd like to hear it said to my face instead of in a way she's supposed to overhear. Silence. Vivian Crow stood in it with an expression Mara had never seen on her face before. Not humiliation exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a person who has miscalculated what the room would do and is now absorbing that miscalculation without the ability to redirect it. It was Harlan Taft who moved first. He walked forward from where he'd been standing with Bess at his side, and he stopped in front of Mara and he pulled his hat from his head, which was a gesture she understood instinctively as something deliberate. "I gave you grief when you first came," he said. "Not directly, but I wasn't welcoming, and I should have been. You earned the water, and you gave it away, and my cattle are alive because of it." He replaced his hat. "I'm sorry I was slow." Karl Gruber said, "We both were." Otto simply nodded, which from Otto carried significant weight. Prewitt came forward and stood beside Harlan with the visible discomfort of a man who knows he owes something and has never been particularly good at paying it verbally. "You were right about everything," he said. "The spring, the channel, all of it. I walked off the job on the 6th day and you were still there on the 9th. That says everything." One by one, in the imperfect halting way of people who are doing something they should have done earlier and know it, they came. Not everyone. Not Vivian's circle, who had redistributed themselves into a smaller, quieter cluster at the edge of the gathering. Not every person in the street, but enough. More than enough. A woman Mara knew only slightly, a rancher's wife named Clara, who had never spoken to her beyond a brief nod, came forward and took Mara's hand in both of hers and said, "The festival committee would like you to chair the spring planting coordination this year, if you're willing." She said it simply, and she meant it. Mara looked at the woman's face and then at the small crowd of people who had rearranged themselves, awkwardly but genuinely, into something that had the shape of a community trying to correct itself. She was not going to cry in the middle of the Red Hollow Harvest Festival. She made that decision with considerable force of will. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." Lydia had positioned herself at Mara's side during all of this, her small shoulder pressed against Mara's hip in the particular way she had of being physically present without drawing attention to it. Now she looked up. "Did I do the right thing?" she asked, quietly enough that only Mara heard. Mara put her hand on the girl's shoulder. "You did exactly the right thing," she said. Lydia nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who already knew the answer and had simply wanted confirmation. Vivian Crow left the festival an hour later, without the ceremonial departure of someone who is making a statement, and with the shorter, more contained exit of someone who is leaving before anything else happens. Mara watched her go from across the street and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction exactly, and not relief, but something more complicated and less clean than either. Vivian was not a cartoonish figure. She was a woman who had built something real and protected it with real ferocity. And she was wrong about Mara, but the ferocity itself was not something Mara could entirely condemn when she'd spent her own life developing her own version of it. She didn't say any of this. It wasn't the moment for complexity. Elias found her after Vivian left, in the relative quiet near the edge of the festival tables. The fiddle player had started up again, and the crowd had returned to something closer to celebration. The tension of the preceding half hour dispersing the way tension does in crowds, quickly, as if it needed everyone's collective attention to hold its shape and couldn't maintain itself once people started eating and talking again. He stood beside her and they both looked at the street for a moment. "You didn't say anything," he said. "When she started in on you, you just stood there." "I was going to say something," Mara said. "Lydia got there first." "She's been preparing that speech," he said, with the tone of someone who has just understood something. "She had it ready." "I think she had several versions," Mara said, "depending on the specifics." He exhaled slowly, a breath that carried 3 months of something in it. "I should have said it before tonight," he said. "What I said in front of everyone. I should have said it the first week in town when they—" He stopped. "I should have stood up sooner." Mara looked at him. He was not a man who offered self-criticism easily, and he was doing it now with the directness of someone who has decided the easy version of things is not actually easier. "You said it when it mattered," she said. "It mattered earlier too," he said. She didn't argue with him, because he was right. But she understood that the delay had not come from indifference. It had come from a man who'd been standing at the edge of something for 3 months, watching her work, watching her refuse to retreat, watching the evidence accumulate, and who had needed to be certain, not of her, she thought, but of himself, of what he was actually willing to say in public and what it meant. "Lydia said something to me once," she said. "She said you can't just pick a name. You have to watch first." He looked at her sideways. "I think you were watching," she said. He was quiet for a while. The music was playing and the lanterns were lit and the Montana evening was coming down cold and clear. The kind of sky that goes very dark very fast once the light leaves it. I was watching, he said. Yes. She nodded. Something between them settled slightly, the way a thing settles when it's been said that needed saying, even if it wasn't said in the largest possible terms. Lydia reappeared from the crowd with a piece of festival cake in each hand and a look of complete commercial satisfaction. She handed one to Mara and kept the other, and stood between the two of them looking at the festival with the proprietary contentment of someone surveying something they consider substantially theirs. Clara Messing asked me if we were staying through winter, Lydia said, eating her cake. We're staying through winter, Elias said. I know, Lydia said. I told her that. I also told her that Mara is going to plant the south field in spring and that we might extend the channel to the Messing property if they want to contribute labor. She paused. I hope that was all right. Elias looked at Mara. That was all right, Mara said. Lydia ate her cake with satisfaction. The festival continued around them, imperfect, cold, full of people who were still figuring out what had just happened and what it meant for the way things would be going forward. Not everyone had stepped forward. Some of them wouldn't. The geometry of the valley's social life had shifted but not transformed, and there was still work ahead of the kind that doesn't get done in a single public moment. But Mara stood in the middle of the Red Hollow Harvest Festival in the October wind with her husband on one side and his daughter on the other, and she had cake, and people around her were talking to her the way they talked to each other, and the compass pin on her collar was cold against her fingertip when she touched it, and the south field was going to be planted in spring. It was not the perfect ending that a simpler story would have provided. Nothing was entirely resolved. Vivian Crow still existed and was still Vivian Crow. The ranch still had debt and the winter was still coming, and there were still people in Red Hollow who would take longer than one festival to change their minds. But Mara had not come here expecting a simple story. She'd come here expecting the kind of life that was made rather than found, and that was exactly what was being made. Here, in the cold Montana dark, piece by piece and day by day, by people who were trying their best to deserve each other. That, she thought, was enough. More than enough. The night after the harvest festival, Elias couldn't sleep. Mara heard him on the stairs at some point past midnight, the particular creak of the fourth step that she'd cataloged in her first week without meaning to, and then heard him moving through the kitchen, heard the soft sound of the back door opening. She lay in her room for a few minutes, looking at the ceiling, and then she got up and put on her coat over her nightgown and went downstairs. He was standing in the yard, not doing anything. Just standing. The way a person stands when the inside of a house has gotten too small for what they're carrying. The sky above the Boone Ranch was the kind of sky that Montana produces in late October on a clear night. Vast and cold, and populated with more stars than seems strictly necessary, the kind of sky that makes a person feel both very small and very awake. She walked out and stood beside him. The ground was cold through her boots, and the air had the particular sharpness of a night that was approaching frost without quite arriving at it. Neither of them said anything for a while. The valley was dark below them, the mountain ridge a black shape against the lesser darkness of the sky. Somewhere in the direction of the ridge, inaudible at this distance, but present nonetheless, the spring was still running. I keep thinking about what she said, Elias said eventually. Vivian, about the marriage being desperate. Mara looked at the ridge and waited. The thing is, he stopped, started again. The thing is, it wasn't wrong exactly when I wrote those first letters. I was desperate. The ranch was failing and Lydia needed someone who wasn't me, not entirely, and I didn't know another way to ask for what I needed. He turned his cup in his hands. He'd brought coffee, which she suspected he wasn't actually drinking. So when Vivian said it, it landed because it had some truth in it. Most effective cruelties do, Mara said. He looked at her sideways. Does that bother you? That it was true at the beginning? She thought about this honestly. The honest answer was complicated, the way most honest answers about things that matter are. It might have bothered me if it had stayed true, she said. If I'd looked at you after 4 months and still seen a man who was with me because he was out of options. And now? She kept her eyes on the ridge. Now I see something different. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the cold had begun to work its way through her coat in earnest, and she was considering going back inside when he spoke again. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want to say first that you can say no, or you can tell me to wait, or you can tell me I'm being an idiot. Any of those things is a legitimate response. She turned to look at him then. His face in the dark was difficult to read, but she'd gotten considerably better at it over these months. And what she saw there was the expression he wore when something mattered enough to make him nervous. The specific kind of nervous that comes not from uncertainty about the other person, but from uncertainty about whether you deserve to ask the thing you're about to ask. We got married because it made sense, he said, because the situation called for it, and we were both looking for something, and the letters were enough to go on. And he paused. I'm not saying that was wrong. It got us here, and here is good. But, he stopped. But, she said gently. But I would like to do it again, he said. Not out of sense. Not because the situation calls for it. He looked at her directly. I would like to marry you because I want to. Because this, he made a gesture that encompassed the yard, the house, the ridge, all of it, is what I want, and you're who I want it with. The Montana sky was enormous and cold above them, and the frost was settling on the dead grass. And somewhere in the dark, a horse shifted in the barn and made a sound of equine incomprehension, and Mara Ellison stood in the yard of a ranch that she had spent 4 months rebuilding and looked at a man who had just told her the truth in the plainest possible language. She had spent a very long time, longer than the 4 months in Red Hollow, much longer. Years of a previous life that she'd packed into 2 suitcases and brought with her into this one, not expecting to be wanted in the particular way he was describing. Not wanted for what she could do, or what she could fix, or how useful she could make herself. Wanted as herself, the person who existed underneath the utility. She had been careful not to need that. She'd been so careful about it that she hadn't fully noticed how much she'd needed it anyway. I fell in love with you, she said, sometime around the 3rd week. I didn't say anything because I thought it was too fast, and because I wasn't sure it would ever be mutual, and because, she paused, because I've learned to be careful about wanting things I'm not sure I deserve. Something in his face shifted, the same opening she'd seen at the spring, that unguarded quality that his face usually protected against. You deserve it, he said. I'm starting to think so, she said. Yes. He reached out and took her hand. Not the brief 3-second contact of the ridge, but fully and deliberately, the way a decision feels when it's been made rather than arrived at. His hand was warm against the cold. Then will you marry me? He asked. The second time. By choice. She looked at him for a long moment, at his face and the ridge behind him, and the stars above the ridge and the whole wide, ridiculous beauty of this place she had not expected to love. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He exhaled. She realized he'd been genuinely uncertain of her answer, which she would tease him about later, but not tonight. Tonight she just let him have the relief of it, and stood in the cold Montana yard holding his hand, and felt the particular warmth of a person who has arrived somewhere they didn't know they were traveling toward. They told Lydia in the morning. She was eating oatmeal with the focused efficiency she brought to meals she considered a formality, interrupting more interesting activities, and she looked up when Elias said there was something they wanted to tell her. They explained it, that they were going to have a proper ceremony, a deliberate one, because they'd decided they wanted to do this by choice and not just by circumstance. Lydia put down her spoon. She looked at Elias, then at Mara, then back at Elias. I know, she said. Elias blinked. You know. I heard you come back inside last night, Lydia said, and Mara's door didn't close until much later, and you were both, she considered, different at breakfast. You were asleep, Elias said. I woke up, Lydia said simply. Mara pressed her lips together against a smile and looked at the wall. So you're not surprised, Elias said. I've been waiting for you to figure it out, Lydia said, with the tone of someone who has been patient with a slow process and is relieved to see it complete. She picked up her spoon. Can I wear my good dress to the ceremony? Yes, Mara said. Can I be involved in the planning? Within reason, Elias said. Lydia ate her oatmeal with the expression of someone whose reasonable terms have been accepted. Then she looked up once more. I'm glad, she said. Not with ceremony, just as a fact, the way she delivered the things that mattered most to her. I'm really glad. Mara looked at the girl across the kitchen table. This strange, wonderful, serious child who had walked across a street in front of an entire town and taken her hand and said she's beautiful before Mara had earned a single thing in Red Hollow, before she'd fixed anything or found anything or proved anything, and felt the particular fullness of a moment that doesn't ask to be larger than it is. "So am I," Mara said. "So am I." The Sunday gathering that followed the announcement was not what Mara had expected, partly because she hadn't expected it at all. It had been Harlan Taft's idea, apparently, though the organization had been collective. A community gathering in the field behind the church building, open to everyone in the valley, framed not as a formal ceremony, but as what Harlan had apparently described, in the direct way he described everything, as a chance to do right by the Boones and say what should have been said sooner. Mara had found out about it 2 days before it happened, from Hannah Gruber, who had arrived at the ranch ostensibly to return a borrowed pot, and had admitted under the mildest questioning that there had been some organizing going on. "You could have told me," Mara said. "We wanted it to be a surprise," Hannah said, with the slightly defensive warmth of someone who has been caught doing something kind. "Harlan said you'd try to make it smaller or more practical if you knew ahead of time." Mara thought about this. "Harlan's not wrong," she admitted. The morning of the gathering, Lydia came into Mara's room before breakfast with something held behind her back and the expression of someone holding a significant secret. She produced, from behind her back, a small crown made of dried wildflowers, braided together with brown twine. The same kind of twine that had held the flowers on the windowsill of Mara's room on the very first night. "I made it," Lydia said. "I've been working on it for 2 weeks, since before Papa asked you." She paused. "I knew he was going to ask. I wanted to be ready." Mara took the crown and looked at it. The flowers were the small, tough kind that survive high Montana meadows, yellow and white, and a particular dusty purple, dried and woven together with the slightly uneven quality of something made by careful hands that were still learning. "Lydia," she said. "It's not perfect," Lydia said quickly. "The left side is a little lower than the right. I tried to fix it 3 times, and it kept coming out the same way." "It's perfect," Mara said. "It's not," Lydia said earnestly, "but it's the best I could do." Mara looked at the child. "That's what perfect means," she said. "The best you could do. Made with love. That's all it ever means." Lydia looked at her for a moment, processing this. Then she reached up and placed the crown on Mara's head, adjusting it with the focused care of someone for whom this act carries significant weight. She stepped back and looked at her work with critical eyes. "Okay," she said. "You look right." Bem. The field behind the church building held more people than Mara had anticipated, which was to say it held most of the valley. She saw them as she walked from the wagon, Harlan and Bess Taft, the Gruber brothers with their families, Prewitt and Sandoval standing together as they'd stood on the ridge, Clara Messing from the festival committee, faces she recognized and faces she was still learning, people who had been slow and people who had been slower, and a handful who had managed something closer to decency from the beginning. The fiddle player from the festival was there too, which she hadn't expected, and he was playing something quiet and unhurried in the background of the gathering. She walked in with Elias on one side and Lydia on the other, wearing her better dress and her father's compass pin and the slightly lopsided wildflower crown, and the people in the field saw her coming, and something happened in the assembled crowd. A kind of settling, a collective arrival at a moment that everyone present understood was important. Harlan stepped forward. He had clearly been designated the speaker, which suited him. He was not a man who wasted words, which meant the words he used landed with the specific weight of things chosen carefully. "Most of us owe this woman an apology," he said, without preamble, because Harlan Taft did not do preamble. "Some of us have said so privately. It seemed right to say so where everyone could hear it." He looked at Mara with the direct, uncomplicated gaze she'd come to associate with his particular form of respect. "You came here as a stranger, and we treated you like something that had arrived in the wrong place. You were right about the spring, you were right about the water, and you gave it away to people who hadn't earned the gift. That took a character most of us would struggle to match." He paused. "Red Hollow is lucky to have you. It took us too long to know that. We're trying to do better." It was not a long speech. It was not an eloquent speech in the conventional sense. There was no flourish to it, no reaching for beauty. But it was entirely true, said by a man who did not say things that weren't true, in front of people who knew him well enough to understand that this was his version of something profound. Mara stood in the October field with the wildflower crown on her head and looked at the crowd of people who had come here to say something that cost them something, and she held herself very carefully together. Karl Gruber spoke next, briefly, something about the ridge and the labor and what it had meant for his family's operation. Hannah Gruber said something warmer and more personal about what it meant to have a woman in the valley who knew what she was doing and wasn't afraid to do it. Prewitt said 4 sentences in the flat, minimal way he said everything, but the 4 sentences contained everything necessary, and he said them looking directly at her. Others spoke. Not everyone. This was not the kind of gathering where every person felt called to contribute, and Mara was glad of that. She was managing her composure with the focused effort of a person who has decided not to cry in public twice in 1 week and is determined to honor that commitment. More voices would have made it harder. When the speaking was done, when the gathering had shifted from its formal shape back into something more like a community standing together in a field on a cold October morning, Elias took her hand again, in public, in front of everyone, with the deliberateness of a man who is making a point without making a speech about it. The fiddle player started something livelier. Lydia appeared from somewhere, having circulated through the crowd with the efficiency she applied to information gathering, and reported to Mara in a low voice that Mrs. Hartley, the judge's wife, who had been part of Vivian's circle at the festival, had come and was standing near the back, and had not said anything, but had also not left. Mara filed this away without comment. People moved at different speeds toward different destinations. That was fine. "Is Vivian here?" Mara asked quietly. Lydia looked. "No," she said. "But she sent something." She produced from the pocket of her good dress a small folded note that she handed to Mara with the neutral expression of a person delivering mail. Mara unfolded it. The handwriting was precise and controlled, the kind produced by someone who had been educated to write beautifully and who maintained the habit as a matter of discipline. "Mrs. Boone, I understand the channel work benefited the South Pasture. I have asked my foreman to contribute 2 days of labor to extending the line, should the project continue in spring." V. Crow. It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement of anything specific. It was a woman who had been wrong making a practical contribution that did not require her to say she had been wrong. And it was the most that woman was capable of right now, and Mara understood it for exactly what it was. She folded the note and put it in her own pocket. "Tell your father when you see him," she said to Lydia. "He'll want to know about the labor offer." Lydia looked at her. "That's all?" "That's all," Mara said. "People come around at their own pace, Lydia. You can't push them. You just keep being who you are and leave the door open." Lydia considered this with the focused attention she gave to things she intended to remember. "That's very patient," she said. "Are you actually that patient, or are you still a little bit angry?" Mara looked at her. "Both," she said. Lydia nodded, satisfied. "That's more honest," she said, and went back into the crowd. What? They held the ceremony that afternoon, small and private, with only Harlan and Hannah as witnesses, and Lydia standing between Mara and Elias with the expression of someone officiating at her own investiture. The person who conducted it was an older man named Whitfield, who served as the Valley's occasional justice of the peace and who performed his function with the brisk competence of someone who understands that the legal part of a marriage ceremony is not the important part. The important part was what Elias said when he wasn't reading from anything. When Whitfield had finished the formal language and there was a pause and Elias turned to Mara with his hands holding hers and said, "I want to say, before witnesses and in front of my daughter, that I know who you are. I've watched you for 4 months, and I know who you are. And I'm asking you to stay not because I need what you can do, but because I want who you are. In my house, in my life, in whatever this ranch becomes because you're part of it." He paused. "That's all I have. That's all of it." It was not poetry. He told her in the very first letter that he wasn't a man of poetry, and that had been true and remained true, and she loved him for it. She said, "I came here carrying so much loss that I'd stopped thinking of myself as someone who deserved to arrive anywhere. You let me arrive. You and Lydia let me put my roots into this place, and you held the ground around them while I figured out how to stay." She felt the thing she'd been managing all day press hard against the back of her throat and made a decision to let it. "I'm staying, not because I don't have somewhere else to go, because here is where I want to be." Lydia made a small sound that she immediately and unsuccessfully tried to suppress. Harlan looked at the ceiling. Hannah did not look at the ceiling and did not pretend she needed to. Whitfield completed the legal portion with appropriate speed. Outside the window, the Montana afternoon was going gold in the particular way it goes gold in autumn, the light coming in low and long and turning the dead grass a color that was almost warm. That evening, after the gathering and the ceremony and the supper that Hannah had organized at the Boone house with a thoroughness that suggested she'd been planning it for some time, after Lydia had finally been persuaded to go to bed at an hour that was much later than usual because the day had been exceptional, Mara sat on the repaired porch railing, the one she'd fixed herself on a Wednesday afternoon in her second week, and looked out at the dark. Elias came out and sat beside her. They were quiet for a while, the easy quiet of people who had been talking all day and were glad to not be talking. After a while, she said, "I want to tell you something about why I left Ohio." He looked at her without speaking, which was his way of indicating that he was listening completely. She told him, "Not everything. Some things take multiple tellings before they come out fully, but the shape of it. A previous life that had indeed stopped fitting her, as she'd described it to Lydia. A man she'd thought would see her clearly and had not. Years of making herself useful in ways that were recognized and making herself present in ways that were not. The particular slow suffocation of a life where you are valued for your outputs and invisible as a person. The morning she'd packed the 2 suitcases and left before anything else happened to confirm that she was right to leave. Elias listened without interrupting, without the urge some people have to fix or reframe or offer perspective. He just let her say it, which was what she needed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That man was a fool." "Yes," she said. "He was, but I let it go on longer than I should have because I'd convinced myself that being needed was the same thing as being loved." She paused. "It isn't." "No," he said. "It isn't." The Montana night spread above them, the same enormous sky it had been on every other night she'd stood under it, unchanged by whatever human negotiations happened beneath it. She'd learned something about that sky over these months, not the indifference she'd feared when she first arrived, but a kind of scale, an invitation to be smaller and more honest. You couldn't perform for a sky like that. It was too large for performance. "I used to think I had to earn every place I stood in," she said, "that my right to be somewhere was always provisional, depending on how useful I was, how capable, how little trouble I caused." She touched the compass pin at her collar. "My father gave me this. He said, 'Know where you are and where you're going, and don't let anyone else tell you you're lost when you're not.'" She paused. "I think I've been letting people tell me I was lost for a long time." "Are you lost?" Elias asked. She looked at the dark ridge to the west, where the spring ran on in the cold ground, feeding the channel, moving through the valley toward land that needed it. "No," she said. "I know exactly where I am." He put his arm around her, not dramatically, just matter-of-factly, the way you put your arm around someone who is yours and whom you're cold and you want them to be warm. She leaned into it and let herself be held, which was its own kind of arrival. There is something that the story of Mara Ellison and the spring and the Valley of Red Hollow is actually about underneath the facts of it. It is about the particular cruelty of a world that decides what a person is worth before that person has had a chance to speak. The woman who stepped off the stagecoach that Thursday morning in Red Hollow was judged before she set down her bags, judged on a face, on a body, on the fact of her arrangement with Elias, on every shorthand the town had available for assessing someone who didn't match its existing templates. And that judgment was not a small thing. It had weight and teeth, and it was delivered by people who would have called themselves decent if you'd asked them. Most people who receive that kind of judgment disappear. Not physically, but in the more important way. They contract. They make themselves smaller to fit the space the judgment allows. They learn to want less than they want and expect less than they deserve. And after enough time, the contraction starts to feel like who they are. And they forget that there was ever more of them than what the world agreed to recognize. Mara didn't disappear. Not because she was exceptional in some extraordinary way. She wasn't built differently from anyone else. And she wasn't without fear. And there were nights in that small room with the dried wildflowers on the sill when the weight of the valley's contempt was genuinely hard to carry. But she had her father's compass, and she had her father's knowledge of water and ground and the stubbornness of things that aren't as dead as they look. And she had, from the very first moment, one 9-year-old girl who had looked at her and called her beautiful before the world had given her any reason to. That mattered more than everything else. The first person who chooses to see you clearly, who refuses the version of you the crowd has assembled and insists on looking at the actual person, that person anchors something in you that the rest of the world can push against and not move. Lydia was that for Mara. And in a different way, Elias was that too, in the slow-burning, understated way that men like him are. Not with declarations, but with the porch railing he noticed was fixed, and the ridge he agreed to climb, and the words he said in front of the whole town when they needed to be said. What Mara gave back to them was what she gave to the valley. She gave them the thing they didn't know was still there. The water that had gone underground but hadn't disappeared. The life that was still moving beneath the surface of a dry season, waiting for someone patient and skilled enough to find it. That is the other thing the story is about. There is water in most things that look dead. There is more in most people than they've been allowed to show. The work, the real work, harder than digging through Montana bedrock, is being the kind of person who looks for it anyway, who reads the slope carefully, who takes a pry bar to the rock that everyone else has decided is solid all the way through. Most of the people in Red Hollow weren't evil. They were ordinary. Ordinary in their cruelty and ordinary in their capacity to be better than their cruelty. And when something showed them how, when the evidence was clear enough and the cost of changing was less than the cost of staying wrong, they moved. Not all of them, and not immediately, and not without the awkwardness of people who are doing something they should have done earlier and know it. But they moved. That is the most honest thing you can say about most people. They move eventually, when you give them something real to move toward. The spring ran through that winter and the next, and the one after that. The channel was extended in the spring as Clara Messing had requested, and as Vivian Crow's foreman had offered labor toward, that contribution acknowledged without ceremony and accepted in kind. The South Field produced its first full harvest in 4 years. The chickens, all 14 of them, continued to operate under their respective names, with 3 new names finally being assigned by Lydia to the 3 who had previously been without them, the assignments made, she explained, after sufficient observation had confirmed what kind of names they deserved. Mara became the valley's planting coordinator, and over the following years, something less formal but more durable. The person people came to when the water table changed, or the soil was behaving strangely, or someone needed to think through a problem that required patience and a willingness to read the evidence instead of the expectation. She was not always right. She said so clearly when she wasn't. She'd learned that admitting error was not the same as being diminished. It was, in fact, the opposite. Because a person who can say I was wrong about that is a person you can trust completely when they say I'm right about this. Elias learned to sleep better than he had in years. He still went quiet when things were difficult, and he still processed most things privately before speaking. And there were arguments between them, real ones, about real things, sometimes sharp enough that the kitchen felt small. But they were the arguments of 2 people who are both completely present, which is a different kind of argument than the quiet, accumulating kind that comes from one person disappearing. Lydia grew. As she had promised to be from the very beginning, she was formidable, opinionated and perceptive and deeply loyal, and occasionally exhausting in the way of a person who is always 4 steps ahead of the conversation and knows it. She kept her naming philosophy for the chickens and extended it, it turned out, to most things in her life. You watch first, you understand what something deserves, and then you name it honestly. There is no better philosophy, Mara thought, every time she watched the girl apply it. On the last night of that first year, the night before the first anniversary of her arrival off the stagecoach in Red Hollow, Montana, Mara stood on the porch with her coffee and her compass and her husband's arm around her shoulders and looked out at the valley. The lights of neighboring properties were visible in the dark, small and scattered, each one a household getting through a Montana winter, each one connected now by a thread of water running through a channel that hadn't existed a year ago. She thought about this woman who had stood on the boardwalk with 2 suitcases and heard people laugh, about how close it had come, not to breaking her, she hadn't been that close to breaking, but to making her smaller, making her accept the version of herself the town was trying to hand her. She was glad she hadn't taken it. She was glad for the girl who walked across the street before she'd earned anything. For the man who'd written honest letters and meant them. For the ridge and the rock and the water that waited. For her father's knowledge in her hands and her father's compass at her collar. She was glad she'd come. "What are you thinking?" Elias said quietly. She watched the lights of the valley. "I'm thinking this is what I came here for," she said, "even though I didn't know it when I came." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it enough?" She turned and looked at him, at this man who was still learning how to be happy, and still sometimes forgot he was allowed, who had grown more in 1 year than in the previous 5, who loved his daughter and his land and his slightly lopsided wildflower crown of a wife with the complete and unperforming love of someone who has stopped managing his own heart and just let it run. "It's everything," she said. Above them, the Montana sky was full of stars going on past the edge of seeing, past the mountains and the channel and the spring, past the dry valley that had found its water again, past everything that could be named or measured or proven. It was the same sky it had always been. It would be there long after the ranch and the spring, and all the people who'd stood under it were gone. But right now, on this particular night, it was theirs. That was enough. More than enough. It was the whole world.